Hi, this is Uri L'Tzedek's Talking Torah and Tzedek. I'm Judry Subar. I'm here with Ruth Messinger, currently the Global Ambassador of American Jewish World Service. Ruth, hi.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Very good. Good to be with you virtually.
Great to have you. Unfortunate that it's got to be virtual, but so be it in these times. Let's begin I'd like to ask you what your current position as Global Ambassador for American Jewish World Service is, what it's all about, and how you got there.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that's only a small piece of what I'm doing professionally now, so I'll mention the other things. But American Jewish World Service is an amazing international human rights organization that is motivated by Jewish values to expand human rights and end poverty in the non-Jewish developing world. And that's a lot to unpack, but we can do that later. But I was privileged to run the organization for 18 years, ending in 2016. And at that point, the Robert Bank, who was the executive vice president, became the chief executive officer. And Robert offered me the position and title of global ambassador. Most of my work as global ambassador, some of my work as global ambassador is speaking, previously around the country, now into my computer, but to various congregations about global human rights. But most of my work as global ambassador is to work on the program that American Jewish World Service runs for rabbis. We identify a cohort of practicing rabbis each year who have the time and the inclination to study global social justice, and we work with them in a series of classes and webinars, and then we travel with them to a country to see some of the work that American Jewish World Service supports. Most recently, we've been going to Guatemala. And then after they come back, we give them some training in advocacy, and they go to Washington to discuss some of the pertinent policy issues in Washington that affect people all over the globe. So in that context, a big focus of mine is working with the rabbis to enhance their understanding of the role of leadership and to enhance their understanding of the leadership concept of moral courage.
What are some of the other things that you're involved with?
So then I work as a social justice consultant / fellow at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where we've established the Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice. I work as a social justice activist with the Marlene Meyerson Jewish Community Center on the west side of Manhattan, where we're focused on both on public programs and internal learning efforts, mostly around the issues of race, racism, voting rights, and immigration. And I just completed overseeing the development of a curriculum on social justice for Milton schools, which will be used in congregations around the country who contact Milton schools in order to use it.
Okay. You've used the term the last few minutes, social justice, and that's a term that I've used myself as well. Different people have different understandings of it. When you use that phrase, what do you mean by it?
So, in some ways, this concept is simply justice. But justice has in our society taken on a quasi-legal notion. Justice is what the courts either do or don't dispense. And it sometimes gets narrowly interpreted to sort of like, is it just meaning does it follow the law? And for me, justice is a much more expansive concept, and it affects everything and how people live together, are allowed to expand their lives, or how they relate to each other, how we continue to undo racism and sexism and homophobia in the work that we do. So it's just a broader concept of working toward what, after all, our sages taught us that we had to work toward, which was a more just and equitable world.
Okay. I know you've worked on some of the specific issues that you've mentioned and the broader arena of social justice in a number of contexts over the course of your career. Obviously, you've just talked about some of them. The AJWS work was a very significant part of what you did. I know that before you did that, you were involved in politics. You were the president of the borough of Manhattan and other positions. I'm sure that given your long and deep involvement in all of that, you've enjoyed that work, and you probably, I'm just guessing, get a kick out of the rough and tumble of trying to address important and challenging issues of social justice. But I'm sure that you don't do that only because, as you've already mentioned, suggested that you don't only do that because you like it. What are some of the influences that have led you to that work and that keep you in it?
So, and first, let me say, first of all, I loved many aspects of the rough and tumble of urban politics. I liked holding office and being able to influence events in the city, and similarly appreciated some of the engagement with other forces, from donors to legislatures, that I was able to do with American Jewish World Service. I want to say that nobody enjoys, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think anyone enjoys every aspect of the rough and tumble of those scenes. They can get, you can get to feeling pretty bruised and beat up. But it all seems to me to be important and necessary work. So the roots of it, depends how far you want to go, but my family was a family committed to social justice. My maternal grandfather was the first executive director of Federation in New York, and was committed to seeing that as Jews we took care of, as the text says, we took care of the other and the stranger. And my mother, who did many things in life, some of which I'll mention in a minute, but who carried on that piece of philanthropic work for Federation agencies. And one of the things that I learned early on, which I want to say politely, does not seem to be clearly understood by many Jews, is that a vast number of Jewish social service agencies, ones that are independent, ones that are part of federations, provide services to an entirely mixed and diverse population. So, for example, there's a Jewish Family Services in most large cities, and it's staffed to some percentage, it's not required, some percentage of their staff and their social workers and their psychiatrists and psychologists, or whomever they have on their professional staff, some percentage of those people are Jewish, but not all. And some percentage of their clients are Jewish, but not all. And I say that only, now sometimes when you say that in Jewish circles, people will basically imply that they'd like to only be helping Jews, but they also like to get federal and state money. So they have to be, but I would like to interpret it very differently. I think it is the Jewish mandate to take care of people in need, and those people are described to us in text specifically as the other and the stranger, which means that it should be broader than the Jewish community. And I'm only mentioning all of that, Judd, as part of what I learned from my family, because I used to have these discussions at American Jewish World Service when I would go to talk to donors. And I would very often meet donors who were Jewish, who would tell me that they supported AJWS because they loved the fact that we worked with non-Jews, which we do. But when I would say to them, well, yeah, but so does your federation work with non-Jews, they would say, no, it doesn't. And so I think that it's a whole issue for the Jewish community to think about. The largest, I don't know about the smallest cities in the country, but the largest cities where you are, Washington, Maryland, those federations fund Jewish agencies for fill in the blank families, for the aged, for foster children. And those agencies serve clients of a mix of faith and race and class backgrounds, which I think is an extraordinary example of what Judaism is supposed to do and mean in the world.
So you're suggesting, it sounds to me, that it's not just that a Jew who also obviously happens to be a human being should work for the betterment of the lives of people who aren't Jewish because we're human beings, but also specifically because we're Jewish.
That's right. And I mean, if you just, and we see it, if you look, I understand that one of the genius points of Judaism is that we managed to write down every rabbinic dispute that we had for 6,000 years. So you can always get somebody who says on the one hand and on the other hand, and I love those dialogues. But I'm also going to say that if you look at sort of some significant sections of Torah and Talmud, the most obvious one that people do vaguely remember when you push them is, leave the food in the corners of your fields. So the implication there is clear that they're like poorer people in the town, and whomever they are, not a means test, by the way, and not a faith test. Only the Jews can come and get the food from the corners of anybody who needs food. You have an obligation not to take all the food for yourself. I mean, that's a fairly dramatic political concept, right? Presumably, we're talking about you own the land, you farm the land, you might have hired people to help you farm the land. You farm the land because you live off the land, and so you consume what you grow, or you take it to market and sell it, and then use the money that you make from that food to live the rest of your life. And that we're told very specifically, leave some of it for poor people, regardless of who they are.
So when we open our hearts and our hands, we're not, you're saying, to ask to see people's membership cards before they
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a powerful concept. Now there, again, it's really great to have these discussions. There are people who say, well, where it says that we should take care of the Jews and the non-Jews for the sake of peace, which is one of the quotes from text, then people will tell you, and by the way, they might entirely be right, that meant, like, if you don't help the other guy, they're going to come gang up on you. You're Jews, you're a small community. If you only take care of your own sick, if you only feed your own hungry, if you only bury your own dead, the people will get irritable or jealous that you're giving out better food and care and services. And so for the sake of peace, try to help other people. I don't interpret it that way. I interpret it in what I consider to be the full generosity of spirit, that to build relationships between and with other organizations, you are obligated to share some of your wealth in a variety of ways.
Okay, that's great. Beyond the question of looking to Jewish tradition for inspiration to work for social justice broadly, how do you see Jewish tradition directing us with regard to some of the issues that we're facing most directly right now? And I'm thinking about things, it's probably obvious, such as the highly problematic history of racial justice, maybe I should say injustice in this country, the huge economic gaps that exist in the United States and beyond, the challenges that the pandemic that we're dealing with presents us with right now. What does Judaism have to say about those sorts of things in particular?
So it's a question that could consume us for the next few hours, and I'm nevertheless going to delay it a minute or two, because I do want to say, when you were asking about sort of the roots of what I would describe as my social justice Judaism, I just want to do a further shout out to my family. My mother, through a variety of circumstances, which we don't need to go into now, but ended up working at the Jewish Theological Seminary, doing public relations, radio and television. So for some of the people who are going to be watching this interview, if you're old enough, you will remember The Eternal Light, which was an amazing program. Not the one that hangs over your bima, but the radio and television program of the 50s, 60s, 70s, which was a program about Judaism, Jewish holidays, Jewish values, that was broadcast on a national network, which is pretty amazing. And anyway, she did that work. And so that was another source for me of learning about these broad concepts of both, on the one hand, obligation, and second of all, of working toward justice, and justice for all people. So, then you have to sort of pick up and dust off and say, okay, so what does that say about today? And, on the one hand, Judd, you can take the broadest notion, right, and say, like, okay, if we're supposed to be pursuing justice, I've always liked the idea of this word pursue, because it kind of means chasing it down the road. It doesn't mean that you can just sit down and create justice. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen easily. It means that it's something that you're trying to make happen. And if you're pursuing justice, then that applies to all of the questions you asked, right? I mean, so just take it at that level first. The fact that for 400 years in America, to say nothing of previously, people made divisions based on race that meant that people of other colors were less well treated, sometimes enshrined in law, sometimes enshrined in practice. That's clearly not justice unless you choose to believe that people are inherently unequal, which, by the way, our text tells us is definitely not true. So if you believe what the text says, that everyone is equally made in the same image, however you understand that image, then the issues of race in this country have not only have there been divisions by race, or as you said, injustice and inequity, but as we're now looking for, I don't know, the second or third or fourth time in American history, some of the solutions that we came up with to ending these divisions didn't go nearly as far as they needed to. So whatever the Civil War did or didn't do by freeing the slaves, it did not end racism. And for my generation, and I'm quite old, whatever the work we did in the civil rights movement, which was significant, and which made some changes and changed some laws, we still have unbelievable examples of inequitable treatment of people by virtue of race. And to comment on another issue that you mentioned, we discover that this pandemic has a race-based impact on people. That is, it is affecting more people of color, disproportionate their presence in the population, and it's killing people of color who test positive for the virus at a higher rate than it's killing others. Those things are just have to begun to be looked at by epidemiologists, medical doctors, public health officials. Is it due to what I imagine, which is really poor health care in most of those communities? Does it have other factors? But whatever it is, we're living in the middle of a grossly unjust system in which if there's a pandemic that hits, some people are hurt much more than others, and we don't seem to have the resources to address that. So I'm sorry to say, but because I think, let me just be clear, I forget when we're going to be broadcasting this interview, but these are very hard times. And it's tempting, meaning it also tempts me, to describe these as bad times. And I think the difference between bad times and hard times is if you can move through hard times with a vision for the future and an idea of trying to make the changes you need to be sure that this doesn't happen again. And that's where I would like us to be.
I guess that relates to the idea that you were talking about before of pursuing justice. That is, that if you wait for times to pass, then you're going to have a problem. But if you run towards less difficult times, then maybe we'll be able to make some progress.
Yes, exactly. But also, if you sort of sit back and say, like, I feel like I've done enough, or, this is a matter of law, someone else should address it, or, it is the way it is and we'll get through this, but there's nothing that I need to do. That's a very dangerous attitude from the perspective of a democracy. That's a very dangerous attitude. And by the way, it turns out that our texts also address that issue. And as you know, they say that in the great debate about which is more important, study or action, they say study is more important because it leads to action. And I just love that, because that's exactly what you're talking about. You pick up the newspaper and you look at the current reports on corona, and you want, me too, you want to just, tighten your mask and say, like, what am I going to do to stay healthy? But that's not, we're actually charged with doing much more than that. And we're charged with saying, what are the inequities and the injustices that are being exposed? and what is it we ought to be doing about them.
Mm. So you just mentioned the image of picking up the newspaper, seeing what it's telling us today, and figuring out how to address it. I'd like to ask you about the following conundrum, maybe. On any given day, when we do pick up the paper, turn on, look at the internet or whatever, we see a given set of social justice challenges that at that moment is capturing public attention. But hopefully we'll get past the immediate problems we're facing right now, which doesn't mean that some of the inequities that we're dealing with, some of the ones that you've talked about, have been solved, but there will be a new set of immediate issues, immediate challenges that's in a different way at a different moment capturing public attention. So it could be that the problems that we're dealing with now that have underlying, really hard to solve bases are still there in a sense, even though they've fallen out of public consciousness. Do you view that as a problem, as an opportunity? How do you deal with that?
I guess that's a great way of phrasing the question. I run into it much more often as a problem. You know, people are like, oh no, you talked about, and I've literally had people say, no, you talked to us about that the last time. So, you know, there must be nothing new to say about gender inequity or nothing new to say about healthcare systems. But I think it is also an opportunity. And I guess my answer is not quite how you phrased the question, but my response would be that that's why I'm interested in helping people develop their leadership capacity and helping people see something called moral courage as an element of leadership. Because we require our leaders to be able to do some of what's implied in your question, to balance some of the issues, to help people on the one hand to focus so they're not all over the map. We'd like to work on every issue. And on the other hand, not to drop an issue because a new issue has taken its place, and not even to drop an issue when you've won one victory. I mean, and that is a sense, and very hard for many people, me and many people I know to say this, but I know how much work I did that I considered to be part of the civil rights movement. And I know personally how easy it was to think about, okay, we've stopped bombing church temples on Sunday morning. We've basically seemed to have abolished lynching. We've cracked down on the Ku Klux Klan, and we've passed lots and lots of court and legal decisions that said that our schools should be integrated. So isn't that done? And the answer is, of course, it's not. It's not begin to be done. And that's not only, as you said, because something else took its place, and because these are long haul problems that require at least a dedicated group of people with a leader to work on them over time, but it's because there's a piece of us that likes the idea of a quick fix and wasn't ready to look with the depth required at some of the underlying causes of the problems. You know, there's 1,000 examples of this, but the one that just sort of sprung to mind was when I was working on all of these issues and helping families of color and helping change the law and trying to improve the school systems in New York. I learned, because I studied American history, so I learned in a very nice way that one of the pieces of contemporary American history was that the US government rewarded people who had fought for us in the war with a variety of benefits to continue their education and to get access to housing. Now, we're not talking about ancient history. I'm ancient, but we're not talking about such ancient history. You know, I learned that in the 50s, and I lived it and was happy about it in the 60s. And it took until literally after the millennium for me to get a full, deep understanding of, just on that particular issue, that the government of the United States and the banking industry with which it worked collaboratively denied most of those benefits to returning soldiers of color. And the consequence is that the wealth difference, because wealth comes out of property ownership, the wealth difference on the average between white families and black families in the United States is tenfold. And that was a matter of law. as well as of more subtle forms of discrimination. So, and unfortunately, there's 1,000 things like that. So I have to be careful, and people have to be careful themselves not to get so immersed in all of these issues that you become paralyzed and unable to work on any of them. You know, it's possible to despair about the way things are at any given moment, but despair is not a strategy. And so you have to get beyond it and figure out, what am I going to work on? How am I going to work on it in a concentrated way? And that is, for me, a place where I think we need to strengthen the capacity of leaders to say really exactly the adverse of what you were saying, or to say, guess what, we haven't finished that other issue. So yes, we could respond quickly to issue X or issue Y, but let's drill down a little deeper.
You were talking about Jewish texts before. A lot of what you just said reminds me of the rabbinic saying that although it might not be my responsibility to finish the work on any given issue, I'm not free to desist from working on it at the same time.
So that's one of the texts that I live by. The one I used before that is from Heschel, who said that in a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. So, you know, if I talk about the current work that I still do with rabbis at American Jewish World Service, and that American Jewish World Service does, I mentioned that a country of particular focus right now for us is Guatemala. And one reason for our commitment to deal with issues of land ownership and land theft and government corruption and violations of human rights in Guatemala, you know, we could come up with lots of reasons for why that's a target concern of ours, but one of them is that actually America caused most of the problems in Central America over time. And I'm not directly guilty. I wasn't making US foreign policy in the 1950s, but as Heschel says, I'm responsible.
So a little while ago, you used the term moral courage, and I think that in what you were just saying about Guatemala and some of the other issues that you've been talking about, it's a matter of exercising that moral courage to try to make a difference. As we've discussed, you've worked on making a difference in a few different contexts. As a politician, as a worker in the NGO world. And I'd like to just talk about methodology for a minute by asking you to compare your work in those two worlds. As a politician, obviously, a politician has constituents and is obligated to pay attention to what those constituents want and what they see as most pressing. In the NGO world, someone working in that world can choose what issues to work on, which has its own pluses and minuses. Could you compare, I guess methodologically, but more than that, in terms of the how you found yourself able to achieve results, those two contexts in which you've worked?
So yeah, I think you've described current reality in the world of electoral politics and in the world of international development quite nicely. But I think my point precisely is that each one of them needs to change a little bit. So, you know, there's lots of great American political theory about what a representative, starting with Edmund Burke, what a representative is supposed to do. And I can't remember the quote, but Burke said rather eloquently that my job is not simply to do everything my constituents want me to do. I basically have to stand up for what I believe is right. So a very difficult challenge in politics, made more and more and more and more difficult by some of the people in politics today, by some of the attitudes of constituent groups and lobbying groups, and certainly by social media. But actually the job, in my mind, the job of an elected official in a representative government is understandably to respond to her or his constituency, but also to to be able to step out on a riskier platform from time to time and say, this may not strike you as exactly what you want in your neighborhood, but I'm a member of a larger legislative body, and I have morals and values that I adhere to, and I'm trying to do what's right for the city, what's right for the populace. When we passed the Lesbian and Gay Civil Rights Bill in 1986 in New York, which took a ridiculously long amount of time before that, but I was very proud to be a leader of that effort. But it was very easy for me. I represented a district where I didn't have to poll them. And I'm not saying that there were not opponents to lesbian and gay civil rights. There were, but I knew that overwhelmingly my constituency supported that. My interesting work in politics was sometimes on my own and sometimes with colleagues saying, we really have to do the right thing here for the whole city and try to explain it to our constituents. I have endless stories, Judd, but there is a story of a state assembly member in the early 1970s in New York who was on the floor of the state legislature when they were voting whether or not to make it possible to, under very clear rules and regulations, but for women to get abortions in the state of New York. And he indicated in a kind of poll that he was against that. And it was clear on the day that they took this poll that the issue, the right to choice, was going to lose by one vote. And he came in the next day and asked for time to speak and said, I've consulted with myself, I've consulted with my family. He later said it was his wife and daughters. I realize that I'm likely to lose my seat, but I'm changing my vote to allow choice in New York. And he is the person who's responsible for the passage of the legislation, and he did lose his seat. But for me, that's an example. I tell people, I tell rabbis, I'm trying to get you to exercise moral courage and not get fired. But that's an example. And then I want to flip the other side. The other side is really the core of what American Jewish World Service is about. We try very hard not to do what you said. We try very hard not to decide for ourselves that access to water is the biggest problem for farmers in Honduras, or that girls in India should not be engaged in child marriage, unless we have groups that are making those fights from the ground up. So I want to be careful here. Of course, we get to choose who we're going to fund. But when we choose who we're going to fund, we're looking for people that want to upset the apple cart in some way or other, that they want to fight for substantial change, even, and I want to make this really clear, sometimes at risk of their own lives. We have lost a certain number of indigenous leaders over land rights issues and over LGBTQ issues. So yes, we pick the groups, but as we pick a group, we pick a group whose vision of justice, that's very much the way I think about it, although they're not Jewish, whose vision of justice makes sense to them. And we give them the resources, the financial resources, the staff support, sometimes the capacity building and leadership training to help them realize their own visions of justice. That is, so your question was correct, because that is not the way most international development is done. Most international development, even the best, is the United States State Department and Congress saying, this year, let's do clean water around the world. And then they basically go in and say, we're peddling clean water. We can give you money to dredge your lake. We can give you money to do this. And guess what? People almost always take it because it's money, it's resources, and it might be something that they need to do, but it's actually not the core of what they need to do. And it's my learning from my time with AJWS which I now reapply, I try to reapply even more strongly back in the States, is that the affected people always have the best idea of what changes they want, and in which order. They're not always sure how to work for them, but it's worth listening to them. It's worth letting them teach us how they want to see change made in their communities.
So figuring out what the right thing to do is, I guess, is hard and can have very high stakes.
Right, and there's some great writing about this. I didn't invent this. We were talking about ancient text, and there's, I guess, well, let me mention first one text which I mentioned indirectly, but this notion that all people are equally made in some image relates directly to the question we're just asking. If that's true, then what chutzpah on my part to imagine that I know what those farmers need next. So I need to learn how to listen to them. But also, and I actually lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, Jed. Remind me what you just asked me.
Well, I was just talking about the high stakes in figuring out what's right and what direction to go.
Right. Oh, right. But I was going to say that, like, we were talking about sources. So another source that I'm fond of, although I know it's a person that I don't agree with on every issue, but I love this title, so I love to give his title. Chief Lord Justice Emeritus, Chief Rabbi Emeritus, Lord Chief Justice Rabbi Emeritus Jonathan Sacks. I don't have it correct.
Yeah. Great.
But he has written some really, really thoughtful books that relate directly to the work of American Jewish World Service, The Dignity of Difference, for example. And he's also, and I use this even more often, he also has just a couple of page document, which is called Jewish Principles of Leadership. And that was the concept that I was looking for, because it's a more pragmatic version of what I'm talking about as moral courage. But it's like, leaders have to go far enough so they're ahead of their communities and providing a vision and a set of aspirations. And then he says, you can't go too fast, because then nobody's following you, then you're actually not a leader.
Mm.
So it's a great pragmatic set of instructions for developing and exercising moral courage.
Mm. Well, you've certainly been a leader in many contexts over the years, and you talked a little while ago about the idea of developing leadership capacity. I wonder if we could wrap up with my asking you to comment on what you would say to young people who want to exercise the moral courage and want to be leaders in the sort of ways that you've modeled, but are confused in this difficult day and age as to how to go about doing that.
Yeah, I'll give you my answer, and then I'll give you Heschel's answer, which is a great deal more eloquent than mine. So what I say to them all the time is, you have to engage in the work of the world. Our texts actually teach that, if you don't engage in the work of the world, you're contributing to the overthrow of the world. That's probably my favorite midrash. But I also tell them, you can't be all over the map. So you have to try to, as you grow, obviously if they're young, but you have to try to pick your issue of particular passion. And that's both because you can't work on every issue, but it's also, as you pointed out before in asking another question, it's because change takes a very long time. And if you decide that you're interested in the environment because your best friend is, and so you go on a few environment demonstrations, that's fine. But if you decide that you're interested in the environment because you've been moved by the efforts of young people, including that wonderful young woman from Scandinavia, Greta something, to work on the environmental causes, and then you do the learning and you do the research, and that becomes your passion, then it's easier to work on one thing over a long period of time, period. That's just true, rather than try to do a little bit on everything. And it's much easier to do it over a long period of time if it's an area that you really feel passionate about. And I think young people do feel amazingly passionate about these issues. And so then the second piece of that is, you have to learn a little bit about how to work for change. So some of this is instinctive. The most recent brilliant model we have from young people were the Parkland students in Florida, who responded to the senseless gun killing by saying we're going on the war path, literally as it were, or on the legislative lobby path to demand gun control legislation. But they were incredible. But then every one of them, and they're doing this, those who really want to stick with this have to learn everything. They have to learn public speaking. They have to learn how not to get thrown out of school, as it were, or fired. They, in my mind, and then I guess I would say this very specifically, at some point, if you want to be working for social change, you have to take training in organizing. You have to take some kind of training, formal or informal, in public speaking. And so the point that you're really trying to get at in this interview, you have to come up with what puts together your moral center. Some of it may be just values you were raised with and you can barely articulate them, but you know what it is you're supposed to do. Some of it in Judaism, I think, comes from a study of pretty clear texts. Some of it may be from mentors or people you want to follow in the world. You shouldn't have to invent each of these things all alone, but chart a course for yourself. Okay, and then I add that I hope that they will take politics, electoral politics, seriously. I actually instruct young people that they must vote in every election in their lives, and that if they miss an election, I will find out about it. That's not really true, but that's what I tell them. And I urge people to think about running for office. So I don't have it in front of me, but I'm pretty good at this. I think Heschel said, and this was Heschel's last public interview, and it was on a television network, and there was a whole interview. And then at the end of the interview, the interviewer says, when we were talking before the show, you told me that you wanted to offer advice to young people, and I haven't given you a chance to do that yet. So what advice do you have for young people? And Heschel said, and I paraphrase, let them be sure that there is a meaning beyond absurdity. Let them be sure that every word matters and every deed counts. And mostly, let them build their lives as if they were works of art.
That's great. Heschel's words are inspiring. Ruth, your words are inspiring. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot.